Can you hear me way back in the end there?
Yeah.
Huh?
You've heard it all before, but
I lived it.
he lived in Five Rivers in the old days, didn't you? Anyway, I'm really surprised and pleased that so many people showed up here. I think mostly it's because of the spraying of Beaver Creek. And I have to say, even 10 years ago, not this many people would have even known what was going on enough to be interested. And so it's largely thanks to people like you guys with the community rights people and that have really brought it to people's attention in a way that has come home now. So I'm really impressed by how many people care. And how many people here are from Beaver Creek? Anybody? Yes. So I really know what you guys are up against, let me tell you. And yeah, there's really no good way to tell people what to do in a situation like that, largely because of the absolute grip that industry has both on our government and our society and our economy, to the extent that what they call traditional agriculture now and traditional forestry means poisoning everything. It really does. And they're horrified at the idea that maybe people don't want them to use these chemicals. And that's how ingrained in the society, in the economy and the government things are, to the point where the industry has gotten our own state government, and not just ours. Every one of the 50 states has laws on the books that were written by an organization called ALEC, which is the Exchange. Yeah, American Legislative Exchange Council, I think it is, which is an industry group that they write these laws, and then they basically pay off legislators to pass them, that give the state the power to nullify any local attempts to control what happens in our environment, whether it's fracking or aerial spraying or even ground spraying. That's how serious the situation is today. And even to the point of making it impossible to sue for damages once it happens. And this is another problem. That's a problem we didn't really encounter because we were up against the federal government itself. And I don't know how familiar you all are with this story, but how it started was during the year after we moved to Five Rivers in 1974. The following spring, the first thing that happened was our children and dog were down by the river that runs right through our property. They were playing there. I don't think they were fishing, because they didn't know how. But anyway, they were playing by the river. And a truck came along with two guys on it with high pressure hoses. And I don't know for sure, but it seemed like they were competing with each other to see who could shoot this stuff the farthest. They were supposed to be spraying the roadside. Instead, they were shooting it out over the river, across the river, on the river itself, of course, the four kids and the dog. And that night, all of the kids were incredibly sick. They had diarrhea, they were throwing up, the dog wasn't well either. In fact, he died. And we called up the county's road department and asked what did they put in that stuff, because we never seen anything like it. And they said, oh, it was just 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. They're just herbicides. It just kills plants. It doesn't hurt people at all. Yeah, but we didn't know that. So then we asked if they couldn't put the wrong thing in the tank, because I told him that would happen, you know? And he said, oh no. He said that's the only thing we had on hand, so they couldn't put something else in there. That wasn't very reassuring either. And but we didn't know what to do about it. And the kids seemed to recover, even though about a few weeks later, there were helicopters spraying the ridge that surrounds our place. It's all sites on it.
Can you be a little louder? Thank you. Carol, can you talk a little louder?
yeah.
Sorry, the cars are loud.
A few weeks after the roadside spraying, a helicopter was spraying something on the forests, on the ridges above our place. And once again, it was National Forest, so we called up the Forest Service and asked what they were spraying. And we got the same answer. It's just this mixture of 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, and it just kills plants, it's safe as table salt, never hurt you, etc. And within the next few weeks, most of our garden died, at least all of a lot of the plants that are susceptible, like tomatoes and a bunch of the different flowers that we have planted, and everything just withered and got curly leaves and stems and died. And that was the point when we had to go all the way to Corvallis to find a library that had anything information about these chemicals. So that's what we did. We went over to OSU in their library and found out that what they were spraying was the same stuff that was in Agent Orange. And that rang a bell, because when we had lived in Berkeley, we had had a number of Vietnam, well, they were AWOL soldiers. They used to hide in our place because they couldn't go back. What was happening over there was too awful. So anyway, we had a bit of acquaintance with what was going on, but also I had read this article by Thomas Whiteside in the New Yorker about Agent Orange. So I had to dig that out too, find that in the library. And sure enough, those were the chemicals that they were spraying on us. And what I learned from his articles mostly was that they had been banned in Vietnam. You couldn't even use it there anymore. But within a year or two, all of a sudden, it was being sold to road departments, to railroads, and timber growers. I won't call them forestry people because they're not growing forest. Anyway, that's another issue. Anyway, these chemicals were being just plastered all over the place, including the national forests, on these huge clear cuts that had been allowed to go unreplanted or anything. They just were brush fields and I call it, unwanted vegetation, meaning things like alders and maples and things that aren't grown commercially. And the Forest Service had been, I can't remember whether they were ordered by Congress or by some presidential order, but anyway, to clear all those areas and replant them because there were too many of them. They were huge. Like there was one not far from us. It went for 6 miles of clear cut, and it was solid tansy ragwood. That's what they were up against, was having to deal with a really negligent way of logging. And their way of dealing with it was poison it all, you know? And that's what they were doing. But the chemical companies were jumping right in there and offering their their banned products that they could no longer use on so-called enemies, but they could use them here, and that's why we ended up getting sprayed so heavily with the ingredients of Agent Orange, because the entire production of those chemicals had been taken over by the military during the Vietnam War. They weren't being sold domestically at all, because the military commandeered all of it. And all of a sudden, they were banned by the military. What are they going to do? They built whole factories just to produce this stuff. And what do? You go around and you create a market, and that's what they have done. So that was what we were up against, and we didn't even know very many people in Five Rivers at that point. But the next thing that happened was a letter. No, it wasn't a letter. It was an editorial or something that appeared in the local paper, in the News Times, by a man named Michael Newton from Oregon State University's forestry department, boasting about these wonderful new chemicals and what a boon they were to the forest industry, because they were just transforming, they were modernizing the whole industry. It was amazing. But he mentioned the names of the chemicals, and I kind of saw red. So we wrote a response.
Something went wrong.
And the News Times printed it. And the next day, I wrote a response. I just said, maybe Michael Newton, he's a professor. What does he know? He doesn't live in the forest, right? Here's what really happens. And I just told him what happened on our farm, with everything in the garden dying, the dog dying, and the guinea pig also had died. But anyway, I mentioned all that, and the next thing that happened was two amazing women walked up our driveway, Susan Parker, now known as Susan Swift, and Susie Gilbert, and they were, they represented FROG, the Five Rivers Organizing Group, which existed. And they used, because we had the mill out there then too, so there was a larger community. And that was, their main function every year was to make a float to put in the parade here on Beachcomber Day. But they also did, they had gotten somewhere a used mimeograph machine, so they would print out little newsletters about the Five Rivers community they were mostly silly things. But they walked up our driveway and said they had read my letter and that other people were having the same problems, and what can we do about it? And so the next thing was that they called a meeting. That was the other thing about FROG, was for $25 a month, they rented the old schoolhouse in Five Rivers from the school department. And we would have, it was mostly a place to have parties. And Bill Gilbert had an amazing collection of old movies, and he would show them, and it was just a social thing. But they called a meeting, and this is long before the internet or any kind of social media, but somehow people found out. We have people from Deadwood, we have people from Yachats, anyway, showing up in the little schoolhouse for this meeting, and we'd never done anything like this before. And so anyways, Steve got up and just told them, he said, you guys have lived here way longer than we have. What have you seen? When this started a few years ago, what was it like before then and what's it like now? And it was amazing, because people got up and told what had happened to them after the spraying, and that they didn't know what was being sprayed. They thought, one old couple thought, oh, well, they must be killing mosquitoes, it must be good for us, and no one really had thought about it, or associated what was going on with their own health or what happened until our letter got published. That was amazing. Yeah, so one guy he talked about he had a herd of horses. I guess he raised horses or something. And a bunch of them went bald. The horrible thing was he had pastured them, he had rented the pasture on our place before we moved there. And that's where his horses had been. So that, things like that had happened that, hunters and some of the loggers who were there talked about finding the embryos of deer that miscarried and elk, and find the little embryos in the forest just dead, And a couple of them mentioned finding fawns that had no eyes. I mean, these were things that were happening that everybody just thought was an isolated incident and hadn't associated it with the spray. So then we got to, well, first of all, we asked people if they would write down what happened to them, what they had observed. And our idea then was we would write a letter to the farm. We were so naive. And of course they didn't. And instead they offered to come out and speak to the community. So we had another meeting. And these two guys from the Alsea district of the Forest Service came out and talked to us. And they all said the same things. They had obviously been to some class that told them what to tell people. That's what it sounded like. And it was very apparent that they weren't taking any of what we told them seriously at all. And after that meeting, again, we were stuck. What do we do now? They're not going to stop after we told them. And that was the point at which we decided maybe we needed to talk to a lawyer. We didn't know what the law was. We didn't know what we could do. And so 3 or 4 of us went to Eugene and went around to lawyers' offices. None of us had any experience with the law at all, so it was just like walking cold into a law office. And the only lawyer that listened to us was a guy named Bruce Anderson, who had been a military lawyer. I forget what they called him. Yeah, that's it. For I think for the Army, but I'm not sure. And then he went into private practice. But he was interested enough in environmental stuff that he had worked on some issue. That was the only one he told us about keeping a flyway clear for migrating ducks or something in southern Oregon. So he had a little bit of experience anyway, and he was the only one who talked to us. And he agreed that he would take the case and he would charge only half the fee if we would do the research for him. And that's the beginning. He said the first thing you need is a name. And we just looked at each other like, a name? We have to have a name? and so on the spot, the only name we came up with was Citizens Against Toxic Sprays, which is CATS. And that became our name, which interestingly enough, this is an anagram for a group called CAST, which is an industry group, a chemical industry group. So that was kind of fun. Sometimes we got their literature. But yeah, he did an amazing job. I mean, I have to say, in those days, doing the research was not easy. We were driving to Corvallis to the library, to Eugene, to the university library there. And then when we found papers on these chemicals, and a lot of it involved what happened in Vietnam, we would try to contact the authors and just tell them what was happening. And the other person I contacted, who I can't tell you, was so helpful. This is a reason to read magazines once in a while, was the New Yorker article author, Thomas Whiteside, who had written those articles about Agent Orange. And I contacted him, and he was amazing. He immediately opened the doors to us of the scientists that had been right on the ground in Vietnam working on that issue, collecting samples, doing all of that. And those were the people that testified for us in the Katz case. And I mean, to us, everything snowballed so fast, it was like all of a sudden you wake up one morning and you realize we're suing the federal government? and we're holding bank sales? But amazingly enough, we won. Because the Forest Service had they hadn't even, their so-called environmental impact statements on these spray projects were about a 1/4 inch thick, and all they were was maps of where they were going to spray, and it was horrifying to look at because it was almost everywhere in the entire forest. But they never even looked for research on the effects. They just took the chemical company's literature and said, well, wouldn't harm anything. So going into, and plus they had said things like, and they said these things in court, that, well, if the dioxin in the Agent Orange, well, they didn't call it that in these chemicals, was ever shown to build up in the environment or in any tissue, wildlife tissues, they would stop spraying. But at that very time, they were telling the court that they were sitting on the results of dioxin sampling of wildlife right here, along the Forest Service roads and stuff, right in Lincoln County. Unbelievably high levels of dioxin. They only tested small animals and birds. And so into mice and voles and sparrows, and I think there were some towies. Anyway, there were horrendous levels of dioxin, TCDD, in the wildlife. And they lied and just said it never happened. And these were samples that have been analyzed by a lab at Harvard. And it was one of the few scientists who actually came in person and testified. Because the judge allowed the others to testify by deposition so that it wouldn't cost us as much. But this one scientist, Patrick O'Keefe, who ran this lab, chemistry lab at Harvard, who had analyzed these samples. And so after these Oregon State University professors and Forest Service people had all testified that no, they'd never found any dioxin in any, and it never happened, they'd never found anything. Patrick O'Keefe got up and handed the judge the sample sheets. So these were just events that happened during the trial. I'm being a little haphazard here, but it stood out that how much they were willing to lie, to the point where the judge even started calling the Forest Service lawyers the Dow lawyers. Dow Chemical. So, but we did win an injunction against the use of half of the chemicals in Agent Orange, which was then 2,4,5-T. The 2,4-D component, they were still lying about, and we didn't have the data on that at that time. they claimed had no dioxin in it. 2,4-D is still used to this day all over the place. Weed and feed products and on the forests and roadsides. And it does contain dioxin, but they lied about it for many, many years. To the point where Congress ordered EPA to have testing done of all 2,4-D products. And I did a Freedom of Information Act request for the results, and I got 4 boxes, blank paper, stamped confidential business information.
What boxes of blank
The
papers?
companies wouldn't let EPA release the data because it might affect their market. What does that tell you? Anyway, at the time of the Katz case, we didn't have any information. So, but the judge did ban the use of 2,4,5-T, which was a major component of what the Forest Service was spraying. And the following year, they switched to 2,4-D. And that was the point at which, I think, was that in the beginning of the murder of Melise? They sprayed the watershed of one of my neighbors, Melise Connolly, who we had brought the forester, the chief forester from the Siaslaw, we brought him out to our valley and showed him all the places on the map that were people's watersheds, and he promised that he would not allow any spraying over those watersheds of people's water supplies. And 3 days later, they were spraying Melissa's watershed. Yeah. Ugh. Anyway, that was the point that she had a bunch of ducklings and baby chicks, and they all died. And she had a 6-month-old son who started having bloody diapers. And then she heard on the radio, that's how I opened this edition of The Bitter Fog. She heard on the radio one of our county commissioners who had bought the Kool-Aid of the chemical industry, and he had done an interview on the air saying how safe these things were, and this was another one of Dow Chemical's little PR ploys. The only reason people are objecting to these chemicals is they want to protect their illegal marijuana crops. So when Melise heard that, she was driving home. She went home. She collected all the frozen little bodies of her ducklings and chicks that she had saved, hoping somebody might test them someday. And she packed them in a bag and took her little baby son, and she drove up to the commissioner's office, and she walked in there into his office and plunked this bag on his desk. And she just let him have it. She said, "Open it." And he starts opening these little foil wrapped bodies. And while he's doing that, she's cut her son on the desk, taking his bloody diaper off. And she says, "You tell me to my face, Mr. Commissioner, that those ducklings died of smoking marijuana. Tell me to my face those chicks are dead from marijuana. Tell me to my face this baby is shitting blood because of smoking marijuana." And she just went to pieces in front of him. But amazingly enough, he went on the radio the next day and did a retraction. He said, "I have been wrong."
Wow.
There are some county commissioners who have been very brave, and he was one of them. He was one of them. Anyway, that was Melissa's story, and 10 years later, Melissa herself was dead of cancer of the brain and a whole bunch of other organs, and that's been the story of too many people, thanks to industry controlling our lives. So, I don't know, anybody have questions? Because I feel like I'm just talking here, but.
How did Melissa's baby fare?
As far as I know, both children survived. She had an older child at that time, a daughter. And as far as I know, they're okay, although I'm not sure about recently, because I haven't heard anything.
Didn't you have another lawsuit? DEP.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, we got, it's addictive. Well, the trouble is, the more you find out, the more horrifying it gets. In 1979, the Sierra Club, an editor from their book division, asked if I would write a book. This was about the Katz case and about his idea was to tell the stories of the people that led to this kind of landmark lawsuit that stopped the federal government. And so I didn't have anything else to do at the time. I said, okay. And I started, I went back and interviewed a bunch of the people that had been involved in the Katz case, either directly or had given us information. And I just started writing up their stories. And while I was in the process, I got contacted by a reporter in Canada named Peter von Stackelberg, he was an agricultural reporter in Alberta, I think it was. Anyway, and he had gotten this strange, they have a ticker tape or something like that at the time, and he saw something coming over about something to do with fraudulent testing of pesticides. And there were no details. It was like just a record made of some event, And so he got curious about it and found out that there was a company called Industrial Biotest Laboratories. They were in Illinois, and they did most of the so-called safety testing for not just pesticides, but pharmaceuticals, military stuff, some of their instant meals or something like that. Anyway, that was a multi-million-dollar company that was cashing in on the laws that now require testing of things like pesticides to see if they were safe. And so, a staff scientist, he was with Food and Drug Administration at the time. He had been looking for a file, a paper file in a file drawer of something, and something else caught his eye, and it was test results on I don't know whether it was a drug or a chemical, but I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've been a copy editor, a proofreader. You can look at a whole page of stuff, and like my son is a statistician, he can spot there's something wrong with numbers without even looking at the details. And it's the same with other things, and that's the way this guy was. He was looking at the wrong file and saw something wrong. So he started going into it in detail, what is going on here, and found out, looked to him like there was just wholesale falsification on this data. And so he started looking at other products that this company, Industrial Biotest, had tested, and finding other things, similar things, including pesticides. So he ordered an audit of the laboratory, or he got his bosses to, and that was the news thing that Peter had spotted up in Canada was there was some kind of a little news thing that there had been this audit of this company that was finding many irregularities. We didn't go into detail, but Peter was sharp. I mean, he had been an agricultural reporter. He reported on things like weather and price differences and how many barrels of something or other they had. He had never gotten into anything involving toxics, but he saw this story in it. He started digging, and what he found was, yeah, almost everything this company had been testing, they were wholesale, they called it magic pencil studies. They just made it up. They made it up. They were testing not just pesticides, they tested like PCBs for Monsanto, and amazing. This resulted in the longest, at that time, civil trial it was criminal trial in the United States. I forget how long it went, but it was huge. Because the feds ended up suing this company for fraud and all the other things you can sue them for related to that, like, tampering with evidence and destroying evidence and anything else they could throw at them. And 4 of the company's CEOs they were actually found guilty. I don't know, I think 3 of them did. I think one of them got out of it by having a heart attack. But the end result was, I love this, that EPA and Environment Canada, which is Canada's like sister organization, had all these studies submitted to them to prove all these pesticides were safe. And they were all invalid. What are they going to do? They had a meeting, and I can't believe they did this. They had a court reporter at this meeting at a Howard Johnson motor inn in Arlington, Virginia. They had a meeting of Environment Canada, Environmental Protection Agency, I think the FDA was there, and representatives of all these chemical companies, Dow Chemical, Monsanto, Hercules, all of them, to figure out how they can keep all these chemicals on the market without any valid testing. And that was what they all agreed how they were going to do that, which was to invent something called conditional registration, which allowed them to put anything on the market until they could redo all these studies, which meant most of the chemicals, including what they're spraying up Beaver Creek, have never had all the safety testing done and valid done. And yet they can claim it's safe.
We're protesting tomorrow at 4:30.
So armed with some of this information, because there was the Forest Service spraying 2,4-D on us and in other places too, and by that time NCAP had gotten informed and was involved. That's the Northwest Coalition for Alternatives to Pesticides. And I think the Hogans, they helped with the Cats case, by the way, but I think they were involved. Anyway, a couple of actual real-life environmental groups, not just fly-by-nights like Cats, got involved, and we sued both EPA and the Forest Service and BLM over the use of untested chemicals as a violation of several requirements under the National Environmental Policy Act and other things that required them to show basically proof that these were safe, valid testing. And they didn't have any. They didn't have it. And because of that lawsuit, the Forest Service could no longer spray anything. what a shame. And, oh, it was amazing. I mean, the timber industry was saying, oh, the forests will die. It was amazing.
Carol, what year was that?
That was in 1983 that came. There's some amazing confluences of events that happened here. Starting in 1981, the APA and Dow Chemical and the other makers of Agent Orange had gotten together secretly and planned a strategy how to get this stuff back on the market. Right? So that was happening all before close to 1983, within the space of just happening. First, my book came out. The first edition. A month later, we won that lawsuit saying they can't use anything unless they have valid testing. And about a month after that, the samples that have been collected under something APA had called the ALSI study, which was this was during the late 1970s. I think it went into 1980. They were for a 1,600 square mile area of Lincoln, Benton, and I think Lincoln. Anyway, they were going to look at the records of spraying of 2,4-D, 2,4,5-D, and correlate them to miscarriages. They called them spontaneous abortions. We called them involuntary abortions in that 1,600 square mile area. They called it the Alsea study because the town of Alsea was kind of in the middle of it. And it was triggered by a letter that, I think it was 7, maybe it was 8, women from Alsea itself, that area, had written to EPA when they were considering whether to cancel the registration of 2,4,5-D altogether. And back in 1978. And these women, this one woman, Bonnie Hill, bless her heart, she was amazing. She was a school teacher in the Alsea school, but she had had a miscarriage. And she had noticed them spraying like a month earlier, and then after seeing what happened in the Katz case, she thought, I wonder if that's related. So she started collecting data in all innocence, going around, oh, I'm just a school teacher, but she would go around to the timber companies and just ask for it when they sprayed and what they sprayed. And then she talked to women in the community who told her what dates they had had miscarriages. And so she put together this letter to EPA in favor of canceling this chemical, saying this is what happened in our little small community within a few months of them spraying. And she listed the data. I don't know if she listed people's names, but she had the information. Well, that would have gotten thrown in a bin at EPA of anecdotal evidence. They were real keen on anecdotal evidence. Except for a man named, there are so many heroes in this story, named Eric Jansen, who was he was an heir to a tobacco company fortune and had spent his whole life trying to make up for that. And one of the things he was doing at that point was going into the offices at EPA and looking at all these letters that were coming in from ordinary people about what happened when they got sprayed. And he found her letter. And he made a zillion copies of it. He went to congressional offices, he went to EPA offices, every place he could think of to get some pressure on EPA to pay attention to it, and they did. and they ordered this ALSI study to look at similar data from this whole 1,600 square mile area. One of the things they were doing was collecting samples from the places where people had had miscarriages, which included 5 rivers, of course. And
Water samples?
well, no, they didn't collect water samples because dioxin wouldn't show up in water at levels they could even measure. But it would be in the sediment, and it would accumulate in any small organisms that lived in or near the water. So they were collecting things like newts and I don't know if they collected frogs or the pollywogs, but anyway, little things that live in the water. And sediment, sludges, that kind of thing, from all the places where women have miscarried. And then they never gave any results. Because they came out, we were there, but that was later. Yeah, Glenn remembers. Because they came out and we went with them to collect the samples. And they and the other thing I gave them was a 4-eyed kitten that had been born. Wow. And they were promised us 90 days they would have results of the dioxin sampling, but we never heard from them. So we started including Elise. She was so nice. She gave them a bunch of her little frozen ducklings and, well, anyway. But we never heard back. And we never heard back a couple of years later, and I was working on my book, and I did a Freedom of Information Act request. EPA said they never heard about those things. That was suspicious, because I had the paper the guy gave me, you know, telling what he had collected. So, right after we won that injunction against them using any chemicals, the lawyer at Oregon's University of Oregon Law School, they have an environmental law clinic there, or they did, and he asked me, because I told him about those samples, and he said, well, do you know where they would have sent them? And I said, well, there are only 5 labs in the country that can do that kind of dioxin sampling. And so I told him who they were, and one of them was the University of Illinois in Lincoln, Nebraska. No, University of Nebraska in Lincoln, Nebraska. And so he called them up, and he talked to this guy who's a guy named Michael Gross, a chemist. Oh yeah, I ran those samples. I sent them to EPA 3 or 4 years ago. So Michael asked him, well, can you fax us the results? Which he did, and they were horrifying.
Wow.
They were absolutely horrifying. And we had a hearing that day, something to do with that lawsuit, because it was, NCAP was there. But so that day of that hearing, I had that sheet of horrifying results. And which I had also sent to Congressman Jim Weaver, bless his Harley tickle heart. He wasn't even our congressman, but I could call him up and he would talk to me. I mean, we have real people in Congress. And anyway, I sent them to him, and he got up on the floor of Congress and demanded a congressional investigation. Meanwhile, I walked into court where these guys had just finished testifying. They were trying to get some kind of reversal of this thing, of that injunction, and the government guys had just finished testifying. No, they've never found any dioxin in any samples, and including human samples. This included samples from a baby born without a brain, and another, I think, tissue samples from miscarried fetus, but I don't remember if it was the tissue from the fetus itself or whatever. Anyway, so there were human samples in this table. And so, I can't remember, I guess it was Michael Axline, or you were a lawyer anyway. He asked me to testify in rebuttal to these guys, and I just got up and handed the judge this sheet, and he passed it out to the other lawyers. And the judge just looked at me and said, "Would you read that?" And I did. I had to read it out, saying how much they found. They were finding levels higher than caused the evacuation of Times Beach, Missouri, because of dioxin contamination. Comparable to levels at Love Canal. I mean, that's what they were finding in some of these samples. And then the small amounts they were finding in the tissue of a baby born without a brain. I mean, it was just horrifying. And I can't even remember what happened. At that point, there were reporters running out to phone in and something about that. Nobody had cell phones in those days. And that was the end of their request to reverse that injunction at that point. Anyway, those were the kinds of things that were happening as a result of a bunch of what they called lunatic fringe hippies or something suing the federal government in 1976. So that's what resulted. And a few years, I think it was the year later, wasn't it, Glenn? They actually came out to re-sample some of the places where they had found. They were hoping to show that there wasn't any, after all. And Glenn was part of that. Glenn Wagner lived out there then, because he went into one of the sampling places at the mill camp, where a whole bunch of the people who had lived at the time of the first sampling. The mill had now closed, it was all overgrown, but Glenn knew where their water supply, he remembered where it had been, and he crawled, I can't believe he did this, he crawled under all these blackberry bushes and everything, so they'd never know he'd been there. And put up a sign, skull and